Thomas Harrison was known in his small American town as a man of discipline and order. To the neighbors, he was the model father, hard-working, polite, and always speaking proudly of his only daughter, Emily. Their home looked perfect from the outside, painted white with a well-kept garden and a flag waving in the breeze. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Thomas believed that strict control was the same as love. He thought his rules would protect Emily from mistakes and guide her toward success. Every moment of her day was monitored: what she wore, when she studied, even which friends she could speak to. His voice carried authority that no one dared to question. Emily learned to hide her emotions, smiling only when he looked her way, even though her heart longed for freedom. As she grew older, her quiet resistance began to form in small ways. She loved to draw and found peace in sketching late at night when everyone was asleep. It was her secret world, a space where she could breathe without fear of judgment. But Thomas saw art as a waste of time. He had already planned her life, college, career, and the future she never wanted. Emily wanted to attend art school, but her father dismissed the idea, telling her that dreams did not pay bills. Every rejection chipped away at her confidence, and yet, she held on to her passion, sketching the life she wished she had. The breaking point came one autumn evening. Emily had been accepted into an art program in another state, and for the first time, she felt hope. She planned to leave quietly, believing that one day her father would understand. But fate turned cruel when her acceptance letter arrived earlier than expected, and Thomas found it. The moment he read the words, anger consumed him. His belief in absolute control turned into something darker. The house that had been built on silence now echoed with rage. To Thomas, Emily's secret represented disobedience, not ambition. He shouted, not realizing that his desperate need to command her life was destroying both of them. Hours later, the neighborhood heard sirens piercing the night. When police arrived, they found a scene that no one could comprehend. Emily lay lifeless, and Thomas sat beside her, his face pale and empty. The father who had spent years trying to protect his daughter had become the reason for her death. News of the tragedy spread quickly, shaking the community and the nation. People who once admired Thomas struggled to understand how a man so controlled could lose everything to the same control he valued. Psychologists, teachers, and parents began to discuss what had gone wrong, realizing how easily love can turn into possession. Emily's story became a lesson, a reminder that love should nurture, not confine. True care gives space to grow, to fail, and to find one's own way. Thomas's obsession with perfection ended in horror, leaving behind a powerful message that echoed across the country: control is not love, and no amount of authority can replace compassion. In her tragedy, Emily's voice still speaks for countless children longing to be seen, heard, and free. After the tragedy, the Harrison home stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, a symbol of the horror that had taken place inside. Reporters gathered on the street, neighbors whispered in disbelief, and the small town struggled to make sense of what had happened. The story spread rapidly across the country, turning into a national discussion about control, parenting, and the hidden struggles within families that seem perfect. The image of Thomas Harrison, a father once admired for his discipline, became a haunting reminder of how easily authority can turn destructive when love loses its balance. Inside the police station, Thomas sat in a cold interrogation room, motionless, staring at his hands. He did not cry, nor did he speak much. His silence confused the investigators. When asked why, he said only that he had wanted to protect his daughter. To him, his actions were not born of hate but of fear, fear of losing her, fear of failure, fear of being seen as weak. It was a twisted sense of love that had turned into control, and control that had ended in destruction. Meanwhile, Laura, his wife, sat at home surrounded by the reminders of a life shattered, Emily's sketches scattered across her room, unfinished drawings that spoke louder than any words could. The community that once respected Thomas now recoiled from his name. Parents began to question themselves: reflecting on how they treated their own children. Schools started hosting discussions on emotional abuse, and counselors were invited to speak about the difference between guidance and control. Emily's story became a symbol of warning. Her art, discovered after her death, was displayed in a local center as part of an awareness campaign. Each drawing reflected pain, hope, and a desperate cry for understanding. Visitors walked through the exhibition in silence, many leaving with tears in their eyes. They saw not just Emily's struggle, but the quiet suffering of countless others hidden behind smiles and polite conversations. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with journalists and spectators. The nation watched as details unfolded about the years of emotional control Thomas had exerted. The prosecution described it as a slow suffocation of a young girl's identity, while the defense argued that he never intended harm. But intentions could not erase what had been done. The verdict was clear, and Thomas was sentenced to life in prison. Yet even behind bars, his name continued to echo in debates, studies, and public discussions about parental dominance and the fragile line between love and control. Over time, Emily's story transformed from tragedy to awareness. Her mother, Laura, began speaking publicly about emotional abuse, urging families to listen to one another with empathy instead of authority. She often said that love without understanding can destroy the very bond it seeks to protect. Through her grief, she turned her pain into purpose, ensuring that her daughter's voice would never be forgotten. Across the country, Emily's name came to represent not just loss, but a call for change, a reminder that every child deserves the freedom to dream, and every parent must learn to love without control. Months passed, yet the memory of the Harrison tragedy refused to fade. Documentaries, news reports, and social media continued to revisit the story, each with its own interpretation of what had gone wrong. Some blamed a culture that glorified perfection, while others saw it as the outcome of emotional blindness passed down through generations. Behind the headlines and public debates, the reality remained deeply personal for those closest to Emily. Her mother, Laura, now lived alone in the same house where laughter had once filled the air. Every room carried echoes of the past. The sketches pinned to Emily's walls had become sacred to her, a reminder of the life her daughter had wanted but was denied. Each morning, Laura stood before them, not only mourning her loss but questioning the meaning of love and control that had governed her family for so long. Outside, the town tried to move on. The school Emily once attended planted a tree in her memory, and every spring it bloomed, bright and full, like a symbol of the freedom she had never experienced. Teachers began incorporating her story into lessons about emotional awareness and self-expression. Students who had never met her spoke of her courage, calling her a silent hero who had shown the world the dangers of suppression. The small act of remembrance grew into something larger. Art programs began receiving donations, inspired by Emily's dream. What had started as a tragedy began quietly transforming into a movement for compassion. Meanwhile, inside prison walls, Thomas Harrison lived with the weight of what he had done. Days blurred into nights, and the silence that once ruled his home now surrounded him in his cell. For the first time, he was forced to face himself without authority, without control, without excuses. Psychologists who interviewed him described a man tormented by regret but still struggling to understand the depth of his mistake. He often spoke of love, discipline, and fear as if they were the same thing. Over time, though, something began to change. Letters started arriving, messages from people who had followed the case, from parents who saw themselves in him and wanted to break free from their own patterns of control. Some wrote with anger, others with forgiveness. Slowly, Thomas began to see the truth that had always escaped him, that control is not a form of protection but a wall that isolates and destroys. As awareness spread, Emily's name became synonymous with a national conversation about emotional health. Schools and families began addressing the silent struggles that exist behind closed doors. Psychologists emphasized listening over lecturing, support over dominance. A foundation was created in Emily's memory to fund art scholarships for young people facing emotional abuse. Her unfinished sketches were sold to raise money for therapy programs, and her story was shared in classrooms across the country. Out of pain emerged purpose, and out of silence grew a message that would not be forgotten. Though her life was cut short, Emily's voice continued to echo in every heart that chose compassion over control. Years moved on, but the story of Emily Harrison still lingered in the hearts of millions. What began as a family tragedy had evolved into a social movement that challenged how people viewed parenting, mental health, and emotional connection. Across the country, seminars and campaigns encouraged parents to communicate rather than command, to guide rather than govern. Emily's name became a quiet anthem for freedom and empathy. Her art, once hidden in the shadows of her father's expectations, had now become a national symbol of resilience. Every brushstroke told a story of pain transformed into beauty, silence turned into voice. For many young people, she represented the courage to dream, even when the world seemed determined to suppress them. Laura, now a public advocate, continued to speak in schools and community centers. Her voice trembled when she shared her story, but her message was always strong. She urged parents to listen to their children, not just hear them. Her words touched countless hearts because they came from truth and loss. Though she lived each day with the ache of missing Emily, she found healing in the impact her daughter's story created. Through her efforts, thousands of families began to mend broken relationships. Mothers learned to ask instead of assume, fathers learned to support instead of control, and children learned that their dreams were worth defending. Emily's legacy had become a bridge between generations that once misunderstood one another. In prison, Thomas aged quickly. His once proud figure now appeared frail, and his eyes carried the heaviness of irreversible guilt. He followed the news about the foundation created in Emily's name, watching from afar as the world learned from his mistakes. Inside his cell, he began writing letters to parents across the country, letters of warning, reflection, and apology. He wrote about how fear had disguised itself as love, how his obsession with control had blinded him to his daughter's humanity. Some of those letters were published, becoming part of the national dialogue on emotional abuse. People saw in his words not justification, but remorse. Though forgiveness was far away, his willingness to take responsibility opened difficult yet necessary conversations. Emily's foundation grew stronger with time. Annual art exhibits celebrated the talent and courage of young artists who had overcome emotional control, giving them the freedom Emily never fully had. Each event drew large crowds, filled with people who wanted to honor her memory and continue her mission. For every painting displayed, there was a story of pain, hope, and transformation. Her mother always stood near the entrance, watching as strangers connected with Emily's work and shared their own experiences. In those moments, Laura felt her daughter's presence, not as a memory of loss, but as a force of change. What had once been a story of horror was now a testament to growth. Through awareness, compassion, and love, Emily's tragedy had turned into a legacy that reminded the world that control destroys, but understanding heals. Time continued to move forward, but the lessons left behind by the Harrison tragedy became more deeply rooted in society. Schools now taught emotional intelligence alongside academics, and organizations emphasized the importance of empathy in family relationships. Across the country, parents and children began to rebuild bridges that had once been broken by silence and fear. What had started as a story of sorrow had now become a symbol of transformation. Emily's name appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and awareness campaigns as a reminder of what happens when love is replaced by control. Her story became a mirror for thousands of families, urging them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own lives. The tragedy that had once filled people with horror now inspired them to live differently, to choose compassion, to listen, and to understand. In her later years, Laura moved from the family home to a small cottage surrounded by trees. It was quiet, peaceful, and filled with light, a contrast to the dark memories that once haunted her. She often sat by the window, watching the wind move through the branches, reflecting on how far the world had come since that terrible night. Every letter she received from families who had been helped by Emily's story brought her comfort. They wrote about finding the courage to talk, to heal, and to forgive. Some said Emily's art had given them strength during their hardest days. Each message was a sign that her daughter's spirit continued to touch lives far beyond what she could have imagined. Inside the prison, Thomas grew old and frail. Years of regret had carved lines across his face. He rarely spoke to anyone, spending most of his time reading or writing. The world outside had changed, but inside his mind, one night replayed endlessly. He had once believed that control equaled protection, but now he understood that love, in its truest form, allows freedom. He wrote a final letter addressed to his late daughter, acknowledging every mistake, every missed opportunity to understand her. It was never sent, but when he passed away quietly in his sleep, the letter was found on his desk. It ended with a single line: "I took your freedom, and in doing so, I lost myself." That note was later shared by the Foundation as a message of awareness and accountability. Years after both of them were gone, Emily's story continued to inspire art, literature, and conversation. Her name became synonymous with emotional freedom and the power of understanding. The foundation bearing her name established scholarships, therapy programs, and support centers across the country. Every child who received help through those programs carried a part of her legacy forward. What had once been a tragedy had turned into a movement for change, a movement built on compassion, awareness, and the belief that love without control can heal even the deepest wounds. Emily's life may have ended too soon, but her message lives forever, reminding the world that love must never become a cage, and that understanding is the only true form of strength. This story is not just about a crime, it's a reflection of how easily love can turn into control when fear replaces trust. May Emily's memory remind us all to choose understanding over domination, and to let love set others free.